Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my husband and co-host, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. Today we wanted to announce that we're going to try a live stream coming up. It'll be on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, 2025. So if you can, grab your margarita and we'll talk some management. Today we would like to ask you for a little bit of feedback. So to make that conversation interesting to you, we're looking for what is currently challenging you at work, either managing yourself or managing others. You can leave them down in the comments section, or you can check the show notes and we'll have a link to where you can leave us some of your ideas for that conversation. Now on to the show. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and my co-host, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow!
It's funny because the AI picks that up as yellow, just as you're saying.
Yellow.
And today...
Oh, when it goes through the transcriber?
Yeah, when it goes through the transcriber.
Well,
yeah.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
That's good for the AI.
Yeah, the AI is going to be very confused by that. You're probably throwing out the whole system. Today, we're going to talk about giving individual feedback. We have a small request at the start of the show, though. It really helps us to sort of stand out from the masses of podcasts. We ask that if you are watching on YouTube, that you give us some likes and subscribe. And if you're following us on any one of the podcast hosts, that you follow us and give us some likes. And we really like comments pretty much across the board. So that would be great. On that note, we will move forward on giving individual feedback. Geoffrey, you want to give them the lay of the land?
Sure. We'll talk about 3 different things today. We'll talk about why we are often sometimes so reluctant to give people feedback. We'll talk about how to make sure that our feedback doesn't come across as criticism, which people reflexively resist. And then we'll talk about the final part, when we're giving the feedback, why it's always more powerful if the other person is drawing the insights and connecting the dots. And those are kind of the 3 planks of the discussion. But we began in the way back machine. Back when old Geoff was doing his dissertation.
On my MBA classmates.
Oh, yeah. That was actually pretty cool. It was kind of a funny story, a good little science story. The University of Texas was very generous to me between veterans benefits, and then in my last year, they gave me a university continuing fellowship, which is a decent amount of money. And so the upshot is I didn't really need the university fellowship. So I saved the money. And then when it was time to collect the data for my dissertation, I paid Cindy's MBA classmates $100 each, which, this has been a number of years ago. This was, $100 for like 30 minutes of work for an MBA student.
And it was right there. You did it right there.
Right there in the business school.
Yeah.
Yeah, the business school let me use a place for my experiment. And it was boom, boom, boom. Just completely, we had them lined up. And I collected the entirety of the data for my experiment, which was taking my peers who were doing experiments, taking them months. I collected it in 2 or 3 days. Like I was done. We were done in 3 days. Yeah, 3 days. Had all the data in. And that was basically because I was in the fortunate position, because of the scholarship money, to be able to pay the people for their time. And then the MBAs know a good deal when they see one.
Yeah, well, I just announced it to my cohort, and I think they pretty much filled up all the slots.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah, Jen Bentoncourt, good friend of ours, and her husband, Jim, helped us get it all put together. And Jim was actually the actor in the experiment. Anyway, I'll tell you about the experiment. So we had Jim as the actor, and then we ran the MBA students through an experiment where basically they were given a scenario where Jim was their direct report and his performance had been terrible. And this is the discussion of last chance. You are about to get fired. This is the final time we're going to tell you about this low performance. And in half of the scenarios, Jim said, I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. I'll do better. And in the other half, he's like, look, you need to know my dad had a stroke. I've been living at the hospital for the last 2 weeks. We're not sure if he's going to come out of it. But some of my performance it's because of this. I've been living at the hospital and we're not sure if my dad's going to die or not. And then we videotaped it all. And back in the old days, you had to actually pay for transcription. I know that seems antiquated, but we had everything transcribed. And we counted how often people said positive things and how often they said negative things, because the focus of the dissertation was on dilution of feedback. The basic premise of my dissertation was we do not give feedback enough, even though we could, both at work and at home. We're in the position with the people we work with to observe how they're actually doing. But most of the time we don't give the feedback. And then when we do, because we perceive the social pressure in it, we dilute it. And that's in fact what we found in the experiment. When I forced them to give the feedback, they still diluted it. And so the kind of first plank for our discussion about giving negative feedback is it actually has the potential to do an enormous amount of good. But most of us overemphasize the social awkwardness. We're overly concerned with it.
Well, actually, organizations promote the dilution. Like this language of care that we hear a lot about, like they're saying basically do a sandwich.
Yes. Yeah, the old sandwich method, which
everybody knows the sandwich method. So
good, bad, good. Say something good, say something bad, say something good.
Right. And when, generally speaking, when it's happening to you, which then makes it seem all the good stuff disingenuous, or it's what you're talking about, which you don't pick up on it. And you walk out of the room going, yeah, they really like me because they heard more good than bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the sandwich method.
But I mean, I'm just saying that, it's not just the nervousness that happens. And I think that happens to
fairly
everybody.
Universally. Yeah,
right.
sure.
I mean, if you care about these people.
Yeah, that's right.
There's going to be there's a level of risk here with the relationships when you give feedback. And so, there's always a little bit of nervousness, and then you're trying to make it softer and you care about them and you don't really want to hurt them. You just want things straightened out. So that happens naturally. But on top of that, organizations are actually instructing people, use the sandwich. And that's a mistake.
The reason that is a mistake is that, and you can run your own experiment on this, but the studies are there. We can put a link to these studies. People always want the bad news first. But because of some of these pressures that the social pressure, and because occasionally we're given advice to soften the bad with some good, we often mistakenly think people want the good news. Next time you have anybody in the room, ask them, hey, I got good news and bad news. Which do you want first? And people will always, not sometimes, not half the time, 60%, they will always tell you they want the bad news first.
Well, it's because you can't really enjoy the good news while you're waiting for the bad news.
Yeah.
As soon as there's bad news coming, you're in a hyper alert phase where you're ready to defend yourself, basically.
Yeah, we'll use the terminology from Caroline Webb. She wrote one of the best books about basically grabbing all the social science together about peak performance into a book called How to Have a Good Day.
That was a good book.
Yeah, excellent book. And so she used the terminology of discovery mode when you're open, like right now, you and we're talking. I have some things to say, you add some things, and we're paying attention to each other and trying to, kind of make sense of a conversation. And a lot of times when you're in discovery mode, you're putting two heads together. You don't always agree on everything, but you're trying to arrive at a solution or an understanding. And then there's defensive mode, when you're, as you mentioned, when somebody says, hey, I have good news and bad news for you. Well, they're not hearing the good news if you start with that, because they're worried or they're defensive about what's the bad. This is in the scenario we talk about most on this podcast, work. There's managers talking to direct reports. And so there's pressure here. This is my boss giving me feedback. It doesn't have to be the boss, but a lot of times it's my boss and they're giving me feedback and they say they have good news and bad news. Well, they're starting with the good. I don't care about the good because I'm on alert. Right. I'm in defensive mode.
Like, how bad is the bad?
That's right. What's happening? What's actually happening in this conversation? And so Cindy's point about this, the sandwich method, give them something good, then give them the bad, and then give them something good to finish with. We don't recommend that for when you have to deliver negative feedback or bad news, because it leads to, first, them not listening to the good, so it's irrelevant. Yeah, I'm just waiting for you to get on with the bull and give me the meat, right? Sandwich, so to speak. Give me the meat, don't give me the buns. And then you're also run the risk of, if you put on too much of all the good, that people don't actually gather what you're saying. And so this was the problem that we thought we would find, and we did indeed find in my dissertation, which, by the way, if you want to nerd out, just punch up my name and negative feedback. You'll probably get the TED Talk. I did a TED Talk on this a few years ago, a TEDx talk in Southampton, UK, which is great. But you'll probably get my dissertation. And in the dissertation, because it's publicly available online, in my dissertation, we found that people, when they would give the negative feedback, in both conditions, but especially when the subordinates of a father was in the hospital, they would give so much positive that the subordinate, we had our actor actually do evaluations every time after, that they would have a hard time deciding what the main message was from the person in the experiment. So we, every time we had the actor actually say, here's what the main point was. Here's what I took away from this. And it was much harder for the person in the scenario to figure out what the other person was saying as they piled on all of the, I'm so sorry about your dad. I'm glad you're taking care of him. You've been a good worker before. You've really got a lot of work. Doesn't mean you can't say some of that. But if the main point is your performance has been so far below the standard for the last 2 weeks, and here's the example, here's the example, and here's the example, that if you don't improve it, the next time we talk, you're going to get fired. And in iteration after iteration of this in my lab experiment, and this is consistent with the research, the person getting that message didn't know what they were saying when they piled on too much of the sandwich, so to speak. And so that's kind of the first plank, is we are overly concerned with the awkwardness or the relational stress that we'll put on another person and our relationship with them when we give them negative feedback. Most of our relationships where we have something meaningful to tell another person can handle it. But when you're giving that feedback, it needs to be clear and unadorned, or not adorned with a lot of positives all around it, because people either aren't paying attention to that, or if they begin to relax and take that in, they're missing your main message.
So this reminds me of Daniel Coyle and his book, The Culture Code, where he talks about high-performing teams and the things that they do. The one that stands out in my mind is the San Antonio Spurs and Popovich, who's, coached the Spurs. The point that I liked about the book, one of the things that he said about in the book, was that, like, with any relationship, basically we always need sort of these micro expressions that indicate, hey, we're still connected. And the problem with feedback is it can feel like I'm losing that connection. And so one of the things that, Popovich would do, like when he was like, yeah, you played terrible today. Like that would come with like a slap of the hand on the back, right? Or some form of connection that is like, still love you, like without saying those words, because we're talking about organizations. And you have to be worried about touching anybody pretty much in organizations, but like sometimes hands and arms are okay, or fist bumps or some stuff like that, elbow bumps, things like that are okay. Most people are okay with that. So there's some limitations in the work environment that make it difficult for us to do these micro expressions, and yet they are really important to basically being able to give somebody the news and do it clear so you know that they got the message, but then you can follow up with some of the micro expressions that indicate, hey, we're still good and we're still connected. And so like I was just recently listening to a book on nonverbal communication. Cues is the name of the book. And her name is Vanessa Van Edwards. And I liked some of the things that she was saying, because she was talking about giving like warm cues versus confident cues. But I think the warm cues are another way of just showing in a very subtle manner, hey, we're still connected. I think that a lot of those would line up well with like micro expressions of connection. So, like leaning in and mirroring, but not to the point where like it's obvious that you're mirroring, tilting your head to the side, which tends to look like you're paying attention and interested. So leaning in, tilting your head, those kind of cues were like, we're still like, I'm engaged with you. Even and that we're good even when we have hard conversations. Yeah. And so I think that might be a way to help reduce some of the barrier. Like you have to get the message out, and you have to get the message out clean. Yeah. And then you have to send the signals, we're good. And part of that is, I think, social cues. Part of that is, look, you got to go out of your way to actually see these people. A lot of the time after people get negative feedback, they kind of duck you.
Yeah, can be. Yeah, that reminds me of all the John Gottman research from years ago about, and there's been a lot of other people that put this together. I think there's a book called, I forget the name, but I think it's called The Negativity Effect by Baumeister and Tierney. And the basic idea is it's a extension of the 5-to-1, 4-to-1 idea. I think it's roughly 4-to-1, 5-to-1 from Gottman's research, extended by Baumeister, of if you're giving negative feedback, that's an interaction that takes about 4 or 5 normal other interactions for people to feel like, okay, we're kind of back to normal.
Right. And what I'm saying is that because it's hard to receive negative feedback, sometimes employees will dodge you.
Yeah, sure.
And yet you want to get those normal interactions as fast as you can, which means that you may not just do some social cues and micro expressions, but you may also go out of your way to sort of find them. And it doesn't have to be overly positive interactions. It just has to be normal.
Regular. Yeah. Yeah. You don't have to. Yeah. It's like, if you have an argument in a relationship, you don't have to be kissing them 4 or 5 times to make it better. You just need to have non-argument, regular interactions for about 4 times or so.
It's a handful.
And
of interactions. Sense. And you'll feel it. Like like they feel it, you'll feel it. Like, when you get back into sort of a groove with somebody. Yeah.
Yeah. Things are kind of a little bit back to normal.
Now, that said, just because you're back into a groove doesn't mean you get to just disregard the negative feedback that you received. You still have to address the issue. They're just giving you space to be able to address the issue.
Well, Yeah, I mean, if I summarize the main point of my dissertation and the associated kind of research that went into that, is that people are overcautious in these interactions, and that results in us not getting enough performance feedback when there's people all around who know how we actually did. And then when we do get the feedback, we walk a little bit too much on eggshells, most people. And by the way, the people who don't, to the one or two people listening to this podcast who say, I don't have that problem, I just tell you actually have another problem. You're a bull in the china shop. And you're probably
maybe there are people who are in the middle.
But
but we do not encounter those for the most part. What we encounter in organizations are people who are trying to wait to see if the problem will resolve itself.
Which gets us to the second kind of main idea from this conversation is you have to be very careful that, because the tendency is for us to drag our feet on giving negative feedback, that we don't give it the first time we see it. Like, for example, interruptions. So Cindi and I got married. To her credit, it was fairly early on in the marriage, but she said basically, you're interrupting me. And that was negative feedback. And I was shocked. I'm like, that, no way. Like, I got a PhD in communication. Of course I'm not interrupting you, right? Like, this doesn't make any sense. How could this be possible? And we talked about it very briefly. It was the whole conversation was probably 45 seconds. Basically, she's like, look, what's happening is you're excited and you want to say something. And so you don't think that it's interrupting because you're excited. And you just think you're being excited and you're trying to add on to the conversation, but you're actually stopping me from talking. And I was like, oh crap, that's an interruption. Completely no idea that I was doing that. I was doing it with Cindi in the marriage. And I realized, of course, I'm doing it everywhere else in my life. Every time that I'm excited about something and I want to jump in. And now
you are excitable.
Yeah, and I do. I jump in all the time. And now I take a half a step and I try to wait till the other person finishes. Or if I realize that somebody's still talking and I've jumped in, I almost always say, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you actually had a very fast and positive reaction to that feedback. It got better almost immediately.
Yeah, but that's the point. The entire point of my dissertation, the entire point of this podcast is we observe people doing the thing that's important to them all day long. With the people in our life, they want to be good wives, husbands. They want to be good brothers, sisters. And we observe the deficiencies where they could be better all the time. We just don't say anything about it. And the same thing at work. We know how they could be better in their presentation to the clients. We know how they could be better in a meeting, show up better. And nobody says anything because of the concerns we talked about in the last few minutes. And that prevents the opportunity. You gave me feedback. By the time you told me I was interrupting people, I was 30.
You were like 32.
32 years old. And I've been doing it probably 20 years, maybe more. And that conversation took 45 seconds, changed my behavior.
Hello, Musers. Now it's time for commercial break.
We have a lot of coaches in the roster. Cindi and I coach, but we got a lot of other people. They all have PhDs. They know what they're talking about.
We do two different types of coaching.
Yeah, sure. Take a performance up a level. That's one option. Or
that's the fun option.
Yeah, sure. Developmental coaching, or something's going on.
Either helping somebody develop, and they're excited about that, and it's exciting to see how they transform, or it's that they've got like a challenge.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a problem, but they have a challenge. They want a second brain. They're trying to strategize.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully you call because it's the fun. Somebody you want to basically take their performance up a notch, good to great.
Mhm.
Or you or somebody you know has something going on at work right now and you want to think through it. We will entertain calls where somebody's basically in trouble and trying to help them one last chance. That's probably only
That's a very
5%.
small. It's very small.
But when you need it, you need it.
Right.
Anyway,
If you're
coaching.
interested in coaching,
Yeah.
ondemandleadership.com.
Yep. Call us. We'll put you up with a coach. It'll be somebody great. If you don't like them, we'll get you another coach or you don't pay for it. Simple. It's good stuff. ondemandleadership.com. I'll give you another example. This one I used in my TEDx talk, but when I left the Army and became a grad student, I was a TA, and we were in the TA bullpen, a bunch of TAs, 3 or 4 of us, and I was telling jokes or whatever, just clowning around, and I was using some of the old, off-color language from the Army that was so prevalent.
And worked well there.
Yeah, worked great in the Army. And this old professor heard me, and he's walking by the door of the bullpen, and he leans in. He got all his papers in his hand. He leans in, and he's like, "Hey, we don't talk like that here. Got it?" And I looked at him, and I'm like, "Yes, sir." And he says, "Okay." And he smiled, and he walked off. And I've never said a bad word in a teaching or a classroom environment since. That was 20 years ago. And that whole interaction was 30 seconds. And it's because that dude heard it. It's like the TSA slogan. If you see something, say something. He heard it. He stopped. He gave, you got to have an example of the behavior. Hey, what you just said, we don't do that. And then he got me to, kind of put it into my head a little bit.
I will say that you are also very good at taking feedback.
Yeah. They say in psychology and a lot of the academic areas that you and I have been either in or adjacent to, you study whatever is your craziness, right? And so I think one of the reasons that I studied negative feedback and difficult conversations is that, like many people, I have a tendency to overthink them.
Well, and you're a cheerleader. So it's not something you like to do. And so you study it to figure out how to be able to do it, which I think that's one of the reasons why, Stop Talking, your book, is actually helpful for a lot of people because they read it and it's a gentle way of communicating what you need to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember I went on tour for that, the Stop Talking book. And once always did a book club for actually Martha Mendoza, who wrote the foreword. Just a wonderful person. 2 Pulitzer Prizes because one's not enough. Might as well have 2.
Yes.
And
maybe she'll go for 3.
Maybe go for 3. We did a book club in her house in Santa Cruz. And somebody basically asked me a question of like, it seems like your book is, the system of communication is very forgiving. What about when you need to drop the hammer? Or what about when you need to kind of coerce somebody or something? And I'm like, that's a different book. No, that's not relational communication.
No, that's breaking or controlling.
But my book on Stop Talking, Start Communicating, it's a very forgiving system because it's relational. And by relational, I just mean virtually everybody who means anything to you in your life, you're going to be keeping up with. You're going to see them more than once. And so you can never screw them. You can never go to coercion tactics. So when it comes to negative feedback, the reason that it was worth me studying and culminating, in my dissertation, the reason it's worth this podcast is it has the power to do so much good. Cindi, in 45 seconds, basically eliminated probably 60% of all the interruptions that I do across my whole life by pointing out what was happening when I get excited at what I was doing. That old guy years ago who told me, basically to watch my mouth, changed my teaching approach. And it took seconds in both of those cases, but made a big deal. We have to watch out for dragging our feet. And then because I don't do it the first time, I'm hoping it'll get better. I see it the second time, I don't do it. The third time I see it, I'm so mad because I'm remembering all the other times
that I sucked it down and didn't do anything. And that's totally unfair to the person because you sucked it down and didn't do anything.
Yep.
But you come at them like a banshee.
Snap. You snap at them and then it's not dialed in right. It's on an intensity level of a 7 or 8 when it should be probably a 3 or 4. And then obviously they're going to get defensive because you're basically snapping, and they're going to see it as criticism. The difference between criticism and feedback, and this I'll credit one of our mentors, John Daly, who's actually was on both of our dissertation committees, who said feedback always offers a way out. Criticism doesn't.
That is a good definition. I like that.
Yeah. So you basically said you're interrupting. You're doing it when you get excited. Like, just be more careful. And that gave me a way out. You didn't say, you never listen. Well, what's my way out of that? Or you didn't say, you're supposed to be good at communication, but how come I never feel like you let me talk? Well, what's my way out? But here it was very specific and very discreet. The old guy didn't say, you're going to be a terrible teacher. Well, what's my way out of that? He said, we don't talk like that here. And there's a way out. And so you'll know that it's feedback if there's a way out for the other person, a pathway to do better, and if you can find what's truly in it for them. What was in it for me when you told me about the interruption in our marriage is it enabled me to stop doing something that was getting in the way of us talking. What's in it for me from the old guy was he basically got in at the ground floor of a person who was going to be a teacher and helped inform my teaching strategy or a piece of it. And so there's a little bit of an altruistic reason as well. Why are we actually giving the feedback? The answer should never be because I'm upset.
Right. And for inside organizations as managers, I feel like, because I don't have the issues that you have with giving feedback.
Yep.
I'm not super quick to give it.
Yeah.
I do try to give people space to straighten out to see if it's just an anomaly.
Yep.
But once it's not an anomaly, I'll give you the feedback. And to me, this is actually a kindness.
Sure.
Because if you don't get this straightened out, you're screwing up your relationships, you're screwing up the team. Ultimately, this may lead to you getting fired. Like, giving people the heads up that they got an issue they need to address, to me, feels like the fair thing to do.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at it that way, like, I think that's why I don't have a problem with it, because I feel like I'm actually doing you a kindness by informing you there's an issue.
Yeah, sure. You're more direct than I am. I mean, there's a personality variable called self-monitoring. We should do a whole podcast on that one day, but basically.
We haven't yet, yeah.
Yeah, you're more direct than I am. And people vary on this trait in the way that you and I do.
Which that is different than saying something negative about somebody's behavior and then me going, well, that's just how I am. Because we see that a lot too. Like, people use, well, that's just how I am as bad behavior.
Yeah, that's right.
And what I'm saying is, yes, I'm direct, but there's the altruistic part of that.
Yeah.
That's embedded in that. I'm giving you that feedback because I think you're going to be hurt. I think you might be hurting other people. Or I think like you're on a path to get fired. And I think that's hard.
Yeah.
And that's why you're getting the feedback. So I'm probably not going to give you feedback on a whole lot of little things that you're doing. But if I see that it's got the potential for harm.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. You know, the people listening to this podcast are probably somewhere in between you and me on this. Most people wait longer than they should to deliver feedback and don't deliver as much as they should. That's point one. Point two is that we will occasionally, because we've waited, see something for the third time and overreact, come on too strong, and people get defensive. And so then they don't absorb the feedback. Point three is that usually you're better off if the other person is able to draw their own conclusions. Back to your example when we were first married. To me, I mean, you said you're interrupting me. I said, but something like, I don't interrupt. And you're like, listen, you just jumped in. I'm like, well, I was excited. And you said, well, that's when you interrupt. And I'm like, what? Yeah, think about it. You get excited and you kind of jump in. And then you said, just keep an eye on this. It's a pattern. You'll see it again. And sure enough, a couple days later, in a work setting, I did it again with somebody else. And I'm like, holy crap, this is exactly it. And I drew my own conclusions. And that made it powerful. When the old guy told me, we don't talk like that here, he then basically gave me a quick check, like a verbal commitment. You got that? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, okay. And then it was in my head. And just the way this worked out, 30 minutes later, I'm watching, back to our mentor we just mentioned, John Daly, deliver a class to 500 people. And he didn't cuss. And he hadn't cussed the class before. And I'm like, got it. And I drew the connection. As a manager, you'll see things in your people. Don't be afraid to tell them, stop interrupting the client. Let them talk all the way to the end. You're overly repeating yourself, whatever the feedback is. That relationship can handle it. And then let them begin to make sense of that. Ask them, what do you think? Because it's very hard for people to be in defensive mode. They're much more likely to be in discovery mode when they're actually trying to put the pieces together themselves. Think of it like this. You think about an important relationship in your life, a sibling, the person you work with, your boss, your significant other, whatever. You ever put your head together and solve a problem with them? Of course you have. A serious problem? Sure. And when you're doing that, you're in discovery mode. You're listening. You're trying to make sense of things. You're giving your points. They're giving their points. And so we're in discovery mode a lot. Two things tend to encourage discovery mode more than anything else. Number one is letting the other person talk. Number two is periodically asking them questions that get their input and keep them talking. What do you think? What else should we do?
Basically trying to trigger the brain.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens in the defensive mode that you're trying. So as soon as anything's negative, it's just like we talked about earlier. As soon as there's anything negative coming at somebody, their brain actually sort of just like goes on high alert and sort of shuts down.
Yeah, this may not be safe. Yeah.
Right. This may not be safe. By asking them the questions to try to get their brain thinking again.
Yep.
You can't have your walls up and be thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, you're trying to think through this.
Also, I think it's a powerful tool in that I think it's helpful when people receive negative feedback to walk away feeling like they have a plan. And even if that plan was of their own making, because you ask them, what do you think? They now have a plan and they feel like they can get out of the doghouse.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. I also think that sometimes people just need the knowledge. There's a famous saying from Pablo Coelho in The Alchemist, something that happens once will never happen again, but something that happens twice will surely happen a third time. And it's this basic idea of, once you told me, I'll use my example again. I mean, my two, because they're clean and they make sense. One's work and one's home. When the old professor told me to watch my mouth, I only needed to hear that once. I didn't ever needed to hear it again. When you told me you get excited and you interrupt, I only needed to hear that once. And then I was alert to it. And because it was true, and if you have examples, and if you've seen it and you know what you're looking at, it's going to be valid what you're saying. Because it's true, it wasn't a couple days before I saw it again. And, that's good feedback works like that. Is that once you've been alerted to something, you might not change immediately, but it's in your head. And then you see it again and you see it again and you're like, Cindi was right, or whatever.
I love that that's recorded.
We'll have to edit that part out.
Never. It's going to be a clip. All right.
Yep. Make that a meme.
Are we ready to wrap up?
Yeah. So to prevent you from having to read my dissertation, we filmed this podcast. Your relationships, work and home, can handle more negative feedback than you think. Make sure you're giving it with an example and there's truly something in it for them and that you're not upset. When we're upset, we tend to overcorrect and ask them, what do you think? And let them talk and try to piece together what you're telling them with, as Cindi said, to develop, how am I going to do something different? What do I think about this? That'll keep them in discovery mode. That's, I think, a good overview of the most effective ways for managers and people in relationships to give negative feedback in a way that people and relationships can absorb.
All right. Thank you for joining us today on Management Muse. We appreciate, as we mentioned earlier, any likes, subscribes, follows, stars, comments, really anything.
Yeah, sure.
Anything that helps. Anything
engage.
Engage. That would be great. And it really helps move us up in terms of visibility on all of these different platforms. So we appreciate that a great deal. Thank you to Sarah, Christina, Rebecca. They're the people who are behind us.
Yeah, making this possible for us to do this every week.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we should probably also give a little shout out to Design at Work.
Yeah.
They're also the ones who are behind us.
Yep. They're a good crew.
Yep. And apparently listening. Hello, Danielle.
Hey, Danielle. How you doing? Emily. All the rest. Yep.
All right. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about the topic, check out our show notes. And if you want to help us out, like, share, subscribe, and 5 stars are all deeply appreciated. See you next time on the Management Muse.